Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at America and World War I. Now, this is a very large topic, and this first video is going to take a look at what was going on prior to the war and then the early few years of the war, just before the United States officially enters. So, let's get started. Prior to the war, the United States is an isolated foreign power. We are definitely a power, but we do not want to get involved in anybody's business. We passed the first Neutrality Act in 1935 that said it was legal for the United States to sell weapons to any nation that was currently at war with any other nation. And this was something we did in the First World War, and it was one of the things that helped get us into the war anyways. On the international scene, we see that Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, and Mussolini is the fascist dictator of Italy and Hitler is the fascist dictator of Germany, signed a friendship pact. Japan will align themselves with Germany and Italy, predominantly because each one of them wanted a different part of the world. Japan wanted to control the Pacific, Germany wanted to control Europe, and Italy just wanted to be a power again. Collectively, they were known as the Axis powers. In 1937, the United States signed another Neutrality Act saying that we will not sell weapons if you have the money on hand. So if you show up with $1 million and you want to buy $1 million worth of pistols, then we'll sell you those $1 million worth of pistols. But it needs to be something like that. No more loans, no more long-term payments, cash on hand kind of situation. FDR, the president at the time, supported the idea of internationalism and that trade could create prosperity. And that's very true. And also the hope that trade would prevent war, which is also true. In 1938, Hitler begins the call to unite all German people, all German-speaking people, same culture, same background, and he starts this in Austria. And the Austrian Anschluss was a series of events where the Austrian people are convinced of how much better things are in Germany thanks to Adolf Hitler. And the Austrian government invites the Nazi regime to come into Austria and liberate them, conquer them, control them. So the Anschluss was an event where basically Germany conquers Austria in a day, and it's a bloodless conflict, if we can use that term. But he being Hitler also wants to control part of Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia was a nation that didn't exist prior to World War I. It was created because of the Treaty of Versailles. Specifically, the area in Czechoslovakia that Hitler wants is this mustard-colored region known as the Sudetenland. This area is where people were predominantly German and the German culture was there. He said that, deserved that land. Czechoslovakia didn't exist beforehand, and he says, I don't want to expand, I just want to unite all my people. And Europe was so done with war, even though the Great War had ended more than 2 decades earlier, that the agreement was reached by the then Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and that's him depicted there, that Hitler could have that part of Czechoslovakia. In exchange, he promises not to take or demand any more land or territory. Each one of these expansions was a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. When Hitler's forces took the Rhineland, that was a violation. When Hitler's armies start rearming, that's a violation. Uniting with Austria, taking Czechoslovakia, each one of these is a violation. Chamberlain just wants to appease Hitler, hopefully thinking if we give him this little stuff, he's going to stop, and that's going to be that. And as we know, that's not what happened. In 1938, the same year that the other half of Czechoslovakia is invaded by Adolf Hitler, the Nazis demand the city of Danzig because it is in Poland and it had a predominantly large German-speaking population. The problem is that giving him Danzig wasn't just, here's another piece of land. You can see on this map that Danzig is in Poland, and it's separated by the Polish territory. Hitler also wants a series of highways and byways and streets that can connect these areas, and this was considered really too far. This was where it was considered no more. With the realization that Hitler's not just going to get more land by asking nicely for it, he goes into a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. And this agreement is that both sides would not directly fight each other, and in the event that Poland, for example, was invaded, well, the Soviets would get half. And as we know, that's what happened. The code name for the invasion was Code White. Some of these early German codes are based on colors. There's also a purple and a yellow. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland from the west. The Soviet Union invades Poland from the east. 2 days later, both England and France declare war on Germany. And for Hitler, Hitler had fought in the First World War. He had been a corporal and had been a message runner and had been injured in gas attacks. So he had seen what long times in trenches could do. He wanted fast attacks, fast, sweeping, decisive, routing attacks. And that's this new type of warfare that the Germans are going to master. It's known as blitzkrieg, lightning warfare. It takes under 6 weeks for Poland to be defeated. And here is the invasion as you can see it. We've got the Germans coming in from the west, the Soviets coming in from the east. Poland really didn't have much of a chance. It's really a miracle that they lasted the 6 weeks that they lasted. And for Hitler and the Germans, this was considered a great victory for 2 reasons. Number one, it is a ideological victory. Nazism does not like the Slavs, does not like communists, does not like Eastern Europeaners. So in this fact, they said, hey, hooray, we defeated this ideological threat. And secondly, since they had a quote-unquote treaty with the Soviets, the Germans wouldn't have to worry about fighting on 2 fronts. That was a major reason why World War I was so bad for the Germans. The Germans had to fight on both the French front and the Russian front at the same time. Now they only have 1 front to fight on. After the fall of Poland, the Allied forces wait for Germany to attack. And France is very heavily defended behind the Maginot Line, which is a series of really amazing bunkers that we're going to see. And this is an idea of what the Maginot Line looked like. This is one of the artillery emplacements. I mean, we've got anti-tank cannons, anti-infantry cannons. We've got independent water, independent food, independent electricity, independent air, places to store tanks and motorized vehicles, places to store and house soldiers. So the French feel that, and this was just one of the emplacements, the Maginot Line was a series of these emplacements that are hidden in mountains all bordering Germany. So the French feel that they are really, really safe behind this force. They can just wait for the Germans to show up, and then these weapon emplacements will tear them apart. Prior to the Germans getting to France, Germany will go through Sweden and Denmark and Norway and most of the Nordic North and just conquer these nations very quickly. And when the Germans finally get to decide on how to get into France, you can see this map is where I say the Maginot Line is very, very strong. And you notice that solid line is right along the border. And then you probably notice that those dotted lines are near Luxembourg and Belgium. In World War I, the Germans went through Belgium to attack France, and it worked extremely well. looking at these designs and defensive borders and what had already worked, the Germans do the same thing. They go through the north, they completely bypass the Maginot Line, they secure northern France, and those big giant guns are real great, but they don't exactly have range to turn around. So once the Germans were behind the Maginot Line was effectively useless. About 400,000 British soldiers will be stationed in France to help defend France from the oncoming German invasion. But once it was clear that the Germans were going to win and take North France, the British forces start evacuating, and they evacuate everything they can out of a northern coastal town called Dunkirk. And the British send everything that'll float to get these guys off the beach. And fortunately, almost 340,000 of these soldiers are saved and taken back to England. But a month after this, France surrenders. And with the fall of France, the fighting in continental Europe is functionally over and will be over for the next few years. France will be divided into two parts. You have the occupied zone, where you have the established government of France, and then you've got the quote-unquote free zone of southern France, the Vichy region. It's treated kind of like a colony of Germany and given a little more freedoms, and I use that term extremely loosely. Northern France has much less freedoms and much more of a German presence. Problems for Jewish people, anti-Semitism, are things we associate with World War II, with the Holocaust, with the Nazis. It's very important to remember that anti-Semitism existed prior to this point in Europe and will continue for a while, and even in this country during the early 20th century. Hitler believes that the Jewish people were responsible, one of the reasons why the Germans lost the First World War. So prior to World War II even beginning, there's a series of laws that are passed in Germany. The Nuremberg laws will remove citizenship for Jews. It will restrict jobs for Jews. For example, no civil service jobs, no government jobs will exist. If you're Jewish married to a Gentile, then your marriage has just been annulled, and you were considered Jewish if you had at least one Jewish grandparent. When things get bad in Germany, things explode into the event known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, a time where the German people, average citizens, react to everything by attacking Jewish people. And the Germans had been whipped into such a frenzy that by Hitler, by the Nazis, that the Jewish people were an active threat to German lifestyles, that it was the German people who go out and attack these Jewish people. And this is really horrible. Some Jews tried to leave. For example, like Albert Einstein, he left Germany before things got really bad, and he was able to come to the States. But some countries just refused to start taking in Jewish refugees. The United States was one such nation that just refused to take in refugees. And one of the sadder stories of these refugees was the SS St. Louis. And this was think of it like a large, maybe a small cruise ship, or maybe just a large merchant ship, somewhere between that size rating. And it was filled with refugees who were trying to find a new home. And they first go to Cuba, they're turned away. They try to dock in the West Indies, they're turned away. They come to the United States, they're turned away. And after almost a year, this ship has to go back to Western Europe. The first inklings of the final solution for the Jewish people came about from the Wannsee Conference of 42. And this was a meeting of high-ranking SS and Nazi officials that said, what are we going to do about the Jewish population, and what are we going to do with them? And the answer was extermination. And the concentration camps had already been set up. They already had been existing for several years. And originally they were used to detain political prisoners, but by 42 and onwards, they're being used as slave labor for any non-person, anyone who is against the state, anyone who is against the racial ideology of the Nazis. And we also get extermination camps, which are usually attached to the concentration camps. This is where those people who are too sick, too weak, too old, too young to work are executed. Back in the States, while all of this is going on, we're still neutral. When the war begins, we are still neutral. And despite the fact that we are neutral, we really see the desire to want to help out our British allies. FDR convinces Congress that we need to lift the ban on cash and carry, because right now England is facing a threat that they very realistically may not win against. And a year later, Congress agrees to this, and we trade 50 World War I era destroyers for some British bases in the Caribbean. So we're not getting money from this, but we're definitely getting an exchange of goods for this. As the war began, and even into 1940, with FDR being reelected, the American people do not want to get involved in the war. Overwhelmingly, we do not want to get involved in the war. 1940 is also a unique year because it is the first presidential election where a president has won more than 2 terms. FDR becomes our first and only president to have won a 3rd term of office. He'll actually also win a 4th term of office before passing away from complications of polio, which he had been suffering from the mid-30s onward. We had the idea of neutrality, but then there's the practicality of neutrality, and there's some things we did that kind of danced around it. Like the Lend-Lease Act. England began running out of liquid capital. So this act was passed that said that we would lend them material. We would lend England weapons, and they would pay us back for them later. Whatever they felt they were worth, they would pay us back afterwards. And when we actually get involved in the war, we extend this to the Russians as well. In 40, we also passed the Hemispheric Defense Zone, and this creates the idea that as long as it's on the eastern half of the Mediterranean, we'll patrol the western half of the Mediterranean. The war is happening in Europe, it's happening in Asia a little bit, but it is not happening here. And as long as the United States hemisphere, quote unquote, is left alone, we're okay with that. So we start defending that line. The Atlantic Charter was a document that was drawn up between FDR and Churchill, and it talked about the relationship between the United States and England. And we promised to help England more, we promised to help defend them more, and this is all before we actually get involved in the war. And it's very obvious that the United States is positioning itself closer to friendship with England. And the Germans want to show that, hey, we see you, we don't like this. So in fall of 1941, a German U-boat sank a American warship, the USS Reuben James. 115 sailors on board will die. And this is horrible. But we find that the greater threat to American safety will not come from German U-boats, it will come from Japan. So today we took a look at how the war began, the different ideologies and attitudes that were going on prior to the beginning of the war. Next time we'll take a look at the United States entering the war. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.